There are applications where your device can be fully focused on clinical use. And there are other wearables where today they are merging with the sort of design aspect of consumer electronics. If your device isn't also ultra thin and has a decent look to it, that really determines the success of some of these devices. Not only does your device have to work and it has to have clinical efficacy, but you have to have usability and manufacturability.
We had a device we were working with a company on a little while ago, and it was actually for patients with dementia. And you think of the usability factor in that, something that they didn't even think about. It was for tracking for falls, things like that. But an elderly patient with dementia is wondering, why do I even have this sensor on my body? So it's a usability factor that if you're not listening, you're not talking to them, their failures in their clinicals and things were basically, these patients, what do I have this on? I don't want this on. What's it doing? Those things have to be taken into account and you have to really listen to what your patient, who your patients are, who's administering it, and then translate that into device language.
Welcome, MedTech Gurus. Today, as I mentioned in the introduction, we have two outstanding guests with us from Solventum Medical. John Dugas is the global leader, wearable technologies and medical technologies OEM at Solventum, based in St. Paul, Minnesota. John has a bachelor's of science in chemical engineering from the University of Notre Dame and a master's from the University of St. Thomas. Over his career, John has held roles spanning manufacturing, R&D, and marketing at 3M and now Solventum. His skill set covers Six Sigma strategy, lean manufacturing, new business development, and medical devices, making him a true leader in advancing innovation in wearables. Now, if his name sounds a little familiar, he was a guru with us way back in episode number 266 with his colleague, Abby Johnson. Dr. Kevin Schwarz is a product development specialist at Solventum, also based in St. Paul. Kevin holds a PhD in organic chemistry and completed postdoctoral work in material science and synthetic biology. His expertise spans medical devices, wearables, biocompatible materials, skin health, and molecular diagnostics. Kevin bridges chemistry and engineering to deliver impactful technologies that improve lives and protect the planet. Together, they're helping lead the way in wearable medical device innovation and patient-centered design. Hey, John and Kevin, are you ready to be our gurus today?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's fantastic. We're really excited to have the two of you. So, John, let's start with you, if you will. We've talked before, and you've held roles in manufacturing, R&D, and marketing. And how has that broad background shaped your approach to leading wearable technologies at Solventum? Can you provide us some insights?
Yeah, no. First of all, I've had the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun actually to experience so many roles over my career. But when we get into this wearable segment, it is, I'd say, imperative that you've got a good cross-functional background on your projects and on your team members. Obviously, when you're looking at something in wearables and medical devices, they need to function. So having that background in research and development, or even peripherally in clinicals, and being able to combine that, it's extremely important. But what we're seeing today with healthcare trends across the world, chronic diseases are growing so fast and reaching so many people and affecting them every day that you can't just look at the effectiveness of the treatment. You have to look at, can you scale it to manufacturability and a cost that can reach, at any place from India to the US. All those things have to factor into both your business plan up front, but understanding, all the options when you're looking at wearables, because there's lots of good ideas out there for treating these chronic diseases, but if we can't reach the world with them, then they're not going to be effective overall. So it's a little bit where the broad background helps, as you can bring in those perspectives up front to hopefully guide yourself quickly down the path and then ensure some success at the end.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? When you think about, where these wearables are going, the different environments, the different types of, skin, the different types of areas, right? To be able to manage all that is daunting.
That Absolutely. And we have to remember we're global now. So when you're looking at a solution, you have to make sure that it can work, as you said, in different environments, anything from India and their diet there to something in China to the US to Europe. You truly have to be looking globally at your solutions these days.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Kevin, over to you. If I've got this right, your path includes organic chemistry, material sciences, and synthetic biology. So, how do those disciplines come together in your current work at Solventum?
Yeah, I think a common theme that we'll talk about here is just in general that medical devices and wearables is really a systems approach. And so we often build them in a Legos approach and then later have to really confront the system. And so when we think about wearable devices or medical devices in general, all of those fields get brought in. Especially as a supplier into medical devices, we often interact with devices where their diagnostic or their therapeutic hinges on the ability to deliver, or something like a small molecule, or is sensing with a small molecule, or these days maybe using synthetic biology to develop their sensor. And thinking about how those come in contact with our materials and how they come all together is really important. So it's really our bread and butter now is that we think about how we design our products with the expectation that we will interact with all of those at some point, and we need to have expertise to interact with our customers and support them.
Yeah, that makes sense. But help me out with one thing. This might seem really simplistic, but I just want to make sure I understand. You mentioned the Legos approach. Can you add some depth to that? What did you mean by the Legos approach?
I think it's the Legos approach is sort of simple in the idea that we all come from a very specific background, right? When we're in a regulated industry, we all have to have deep expertise in an area. And so often when we think about a new concept or we're designing something, we're thinking about the thing we know best. And so oftentimes you may have that you've designed the sensor a certain way, and that's because you have a very good and strong background in diagnostics or molecular diagnostics, but you may not understand material science. And so what often happens is we say, okay, I've made the best sensor. And then we go to put it into a device, and it turns out the best sensor does not necessarily work in the device the way you've designed it. And so oftentimes we're kind of saying, my expertise has made this Lego, and then I'm going to try and combine it with somebody else's Lego, but we didn't do it at once, right? And so it looks good at first, and then sometimes they don't always click together.
Gotcha. That was very helpful. Thanks for that explanation. So, John, you've noted that the longer wearable products can be worn for chronic disease management, the better the outcomes. So, for our gurus out there, I'm wondering if you can expand on wear time is such a critical success factor.
Yeah, no, we put a lot of effort into that, and for good reasons. What we've seen out there in the marketplace is there's really two ways that extending wear time really can affect the healthcare marketplace. It's really cost and compliance, and I'll talk about each of them a little bit separately. Cost is the one, it's usually a little bit easier to understand because if you've got a wearable and you ended up putting that cost on your body once a month, or if you put it on it once a day, that's 30 times the waste of just tossing something in the garbage. Plus, the fact is, a lot of times you'll need healthcare workers to enable you putting on these devices or working with these devices. Again, if you have to, we have a shortage of healthcare workers. If they have to interact with you to get that on, extending your wear time and your lifetime of your device isn't just waste of the devices, but it's waste of the healthcare workers' time to put that on or work with you in that realm. So cost is a big thing. If I can put something out there for 30 days, much better. I would say the bigger aspect for just individuals themselves is compliance. If you think about the longer wear time you can get, if I can do a treatment or a monitoring of a device, if I can administer that once a month versus once a day, I'm going to be much more compliant of it. You think about the fastest growing chronic disease on the planet is diabetes. I mean, it's just skyrocketing, changes to diets, things like that. The traditional way of dealing with diabetes was the finger stick, where you'd prick your finger a couple of times a day, draw a drop of blood on there, and get that measurement. And if you think about that from a compliance standpoint, you have to have the supplies with you all the time. you have to have the time to do it, and you have to have a place to do it, appropriately, cleanliness, that type of stuff. So it's much more, you're going to fall into a pattern of non-compliance when you're doing something like that versus, again, if I can on the first of the month put something that's on my arm for diabetes that it's unobtrusive, I don't have to worry about it, I don't have to deal with all that application, my compliance level is going to be much higher on those devices than it is on something where you need more supplies on a daily routine. So I mean, cost is a big one, but really compliance and down to the patient level, extremely important that we can make these as easy to use and convenient in people's lives. It's going to change their outcome.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and thanks for that. And Kevin, with your background, right, it would make sense that adhesives and materials are really the core of wearable performance, right? So, from your perspective, what breakthroughs in chemistry and material science are enabling longer wear times? Do you have any input for us?
Yeah, and maybe I can set the stage a little bit here. Obviously, technologies go in sort of distinct phases. And many listeners will know that medical devices sort of have always struggled with scale at maturity. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes selling 10,000 devices per year is maturity for many of these very specific diagnostics. And especially for wearables, when we think about adhesive patches, the device itself can be very expensive and be very complicated, but oftentimes you're asking these component manufacturers to supply something to you that's, in order for them to have a business, they need to make much more than just for your device. And so what that ultimately means is that there's not been a driver in wearables until fairly recently to think about making medical tapes and devices distinct to wearables. And so with the boom of glucose monitors and insulin pumps, I think what we've really seen is an opening up of the scale to really design specific to wearables. And so when we think about where adhesives were classically or more recently, right, they're typically designed in critical care settings where the length of time is almost gated specifically by 7 days of wear, because that's when you change a dressing at most. And so when we think about today's wearables that are generally saying they want to wear till 15 days, and now the next gen are thinking about 30 or even 90 days, I'd equate it to thinking about sort of like if you are a runner and you would normally say, okay, well, I'm used to running a 5K or a 10K, and now we want to run a half marathon. Well, if you're in half marathon, or if you're in a good runner running 5 or 10K, a half marathon, that's maybe reasonable. But if you suddenly say, I'm going to go run a 100-mile, race, that requires a different level of training and it's a different setting, right? And so when we think about what we've looked at and what we've sort of been reaching for is thinking about as that applies to sticking to skin. So in the 7-day time frame, or even out to 15 days, of course, everyone sweats, everyone has skin oil, but generally your skin, a good rule of thumb is that about 15 days it's starting to turn over in a significant way. And so for all of the devices that wanted to wear for 7 days or even 15 days, they haven't reached a mark where the outer layer that you're sticking to is no longer wants to be a part of you, right? It's ready to flake away or any of those things. And so that requires a different design altogether. And so a lot of what we are doing now and a lot of what's coming into the next generation to improve wear is designing specifically to handle many, many cycles of sweat and oil and skin turnover and all of life's activities, right? We think about a lot of these tapes have been designed in critical care settings and not necessarily to be an Olympic diver or to be just in everyday care, right? To hold up to a child or a pet deciding that they want to, interact with your medical device. And so I think a lot of the design is thinking about the patient and the skin and what it goes through and really designing for it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like, the complexity of this goes up geometrically as we expand, the timeframes, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very helpful. And John, in past discussions and watching what you and your team are doing, I know that Solventum has really invested significantly in optimizing adhesives and device design. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, the roll structures and some of the overlays and how they play in improving wear time. From your perspective, can you provide us some insights with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin really started on that question there really, really well. Just for the concept and the term, overlay. What we're talking about in an overlay is something covering the top of your device, not just bonding the device itself to your skin, but something that covers over the top and usually extends outside of the device itself on there. And the criticality of something like that goes along with what Kevin was saying, your daily life and what do you encounter in daily life. We're lucky at Solventum to have internal clinicals, internal clinical group. Being a device company ourselves, we got those resources internally, and we've been able to explore some of the concepts of, Kevin mentioned sweat and skin. We've been able to explore even some of the outside concepts that keep these devices on your body. One of the interesting clinicals that I happen to be able to see in uh, experience really was a back of the arm clinical where we studied the effects of sort of outside environment and what was happening. And it was interesting. We all know our bodies really, really well. One of the factors is think about when you open a door on a daily basis. When you open that door, you don't open the door really, really wide and walk through the full doorway. You open it just wide enough for your shoulder just to pass through. I mean, so if you're in a colder climate, you may notice in the winter you brush your jacket on it more. Those are the types of daily interactions every day that can really affect your devices and how you're wearing them. You don't realize how many knocks on your shoulder you get by just passing just inside of that door. So that's the types of things as we're advancing, our adhesive and our study of devices and design that we're really trying to look at to understand and overcome. The other thing is clothing. What's your effective clothing? If you're wearing a device on your body all day, it's constantly rubbing up against that device. One of the worst things that you can do to an adhesive is start getting a little bit of lifting on the edge of that device. But if you're constantly rubbing the edge of that device, you might get a little bit of lift. So the concept that we've worked on is really looking at clinicals on how can you minimize those knockoffs? How can you spread out the stresses on, the edge of your tapes and adhesives so they don't come off? And one of that is using a very thin film overlay over the top of your device. Your edges don't roll up as much. When you knock on a door, it absorbs some of those stresses with your device and really changes that wear time. We had a clinical with one of our shorter term wear tapes on the body, holding something on the body. And then when we added in a little bit of an overlay over the top of it, our survivability of the number of devices that survived increased 4 times. So just little design changes or little bits of, for example, overlay in this instance can definitely improve your wear time every day as you're going about your daily life, and you have to worry a lot less about it. The other thing with the overlay and talking about it is you think about these devices. And Kevin was talking about the advances in sensors and things like that. Most of those sensors are rigid or have rigid parts to it, rigid electronics, rigid batteries, things like that. Your skin is not rigid. Your daily life, the stuff moving around, clothes around it are not rigid. And so little things like adding overlay, adjusting your design on a skirt, like how far you go out around your device, can really change the stresses that your device sees and keep them on the body for much longer. So it's on the adhesive, it's on the design, but it's also doing the appropriate background clinicals that all stems from showing you where those failure modes are in daily life. Because you can sit there all day and talk about what something might experience, but when you're actually look at people's daily life, everyone's life is different. Finding those commonalities is really, really difficult. So tying all that back into design and basic concepts of it, something that we try to do from clinicals all the way down to the device itself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I would think that overlay gives it a nice smooth surface, as you mentioned, for things to glide over, right? Versus, I'm thinking even a Band-Aid sometimes, right? You can kind of feel that rigid edge when you're, wearing, changing your clothes or what have you. You can feel that. Is that the right track there?
Yep, no, absolutely right track. And again, bandages you're wearing for a day, 2 days, something like that, and we all know how they look and how they feel after after a couple of days, and most of the time they're going to come off and they're going to look ugly, get all gross and everything. And that's another thing, as you're talking about those bandages, that overlay helps keep out the water, out the dirt, things like that. That again, if I'm wearing something for a month, it's going to experience a lot of different challenges. And so that's another, what you brought up, another reason for those overlays is keep that dirt out, keep that gross daily stuff out of there.
Yeah, gotcha. And Kevin, doing my research and getting ready for this episode, yeah, I noted that your team had spent a lot of time studying overlays, and I think there's a newer product, the 4579 thin film overlay, if I've got that right. So to build on what John was talking about, can you help us out why the thin film, and what other unique benefits it brings to performance and patient experience?
Yeah, of course. So John touched a bit on being able to sort of protect the device. And he also touched a little bit on that traditionally today, devices are made as hard goods. They typically use hard plastics, they are not flexible, and then we're putting them on skin, which is the very opposite, right? It is often soft, it is very stretchy, it is producing lots of fluids. And so for us, it really starts with thinking about skin in a way that maybe 10 or 15 years ago we didn't think about, because now it is just as much about sticking to skin as preserving skin health. And so for us, it's really about using thin films as a way to keep the skin being able to breathe and stretch as freely as possible, because generally what we've seen in both our clinicals and in the lab is that, it may seem simple that sort of happy, healthy skin is essential certainly for patients, but it's also essential for device function, because as soon as you start to build up moisture or you're stretching on the skin, of course it's uncomfortable for patients, but it also makes it very difficult to stick long term because it starts to jeopardize the integrity of the skin. And so we've spent a long time looking at how we improve comfort and allow the skin to really just live freely.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And John, I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, right? You touched on the importance of some of the internal studies and studies in general with customers. So, with that, when you're trying to validate new solutions, why are these studies so important? Many of our gurus out there are facing similar challenges. And I'm wondering if you can share an example as to how Solventum has partnered with customers to prove the concept and to help enhance performance. Can you provide us any thoughts there?
Yeah, so a little bit of guidance on that. When we talk about collaborating, and we do this quite often with customers on clinicals, I think there's sort of two aspects of it. There's the result itself, which obviously is important in understanding what comes out. Is their device functioning as it should? But more importantly is the background and the understanding of the clinical itself that comes out of that. And what I mean by understanding, when we collaborate with somebody, it's important. And a lot of times we've done some comparison studies in the past where they've done their own clinical study and we do a replicate clinical study internally. And the collaboration really comes in there on, you have to look at those protocols and what they're doing exactly like for like, because little things like preparation of skin and how that's done, or little location changes. If different parts of your body have sweat differently, just minor location changes, how hard you push down on the device there can cause differences in clinical outcomes. And that's where you really have to be collaborative, especially when you're comparing two studies. And that's where you can start to pull out and draw out some of those factors that really matter. Not just that, hey, if I'm looking for my device to stay on 15 days and it survived 9, that's great that gives you a little bit of definition on you're not there yet, but it's really the collaboration on the behind and the why that makes sense. And so one is making sure that everybody's doing the same. And if you're not, what are those differences? The other reason on the why is to truly take that back to the laboratory so you and your partner that you're collaborating with can do less studies. Let's understand those whys so I can take it back to a benchtop and figure out whether it's a validated test or even a practical test, I'll say, on any new devices. So you just don't have to run clinical after clinical. You can really look at what is the practical application, what are the tests, and we've done that a lot with partners. And okay, we've ran the clinical, we had, by doing it ourselves and neither party contracting out, we're able to actually see the results and what's happening and drive some benchtop tests that we've shared with customers that are very simple, but can help them up front understand their design better so we don't waste money on a second clinical before we're truly ready. So the collaboration comes in, and yes, doing it for partners, but we've had greater success when you're actually getting down into the understanding of it, talking clinical to clinical, comparing protocols, and then truly understanding the outcomes, not just a number, but what is happening and why, so that we can look at some simple benchtops to avoid doing too many other clinicals.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it sounds like it's really that upfront work, right? I'm thinking it might be relatively painstaking, right, to design those studies and really nail that down, but it's going to pay off in the long run if you've done that initial homework, right?
Yep. And if you're contracting out with someone doing a clinical, you have to ask that question up front. If you want to take a look at your device and the failure of it afterwards, a lot of those outside clinical companies may just discard the devices and they're giving you that number and an abbreviated report on it. But if there's specific data you want to see, you want to make sure you ask those questions up front. And that's where having multiple people talk with those, if you're outside contracting a clinical study, if you don't ask for that information up front to truly understand what you're doing, it's tough to go back and get that information afterwards. So having multiple perspectives up front on a clinical study and making sure you really understand what you want, which could be things like getting devices back. And most of the time that's not common. They'll do the clinical study and they'll throw them away afterwards because they're biocontaminated and things like that. You need to ask for that stuff up front in any of your collaborations. Otherwise, you won't get that answer and you'll have to run another study.
Yeah. Yeah, gotcha. And Kevin, I'm interested in your take on this too, right? With your background, I'm wondering, to help our gurus out there, we've talked a little bit about collaboration and how key that is in product development. Well, from your perspective, what have you learned that would help entrepreneurs with working side by side with clinicians and engineers to solve these solutions? Can you provide us any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, obviously the sort of simple upfront is that you are selecting and working with people that you connect well with and that you trust and that you believe can do those functions. Because as an entrepreneur, you have in a lot of ways, it's similar to the product development role in a bigger company, which is your job is a little bit everybody else's job, right? And I think that there's a couple of things. Connecting, we talked a little bit about the Lego approach earlier, and recognizing that when you have an engineering team, they're bringing their Legos and you're asking them for a solution. And those Legos are probably not the same Legos that the clinician is playing with. And they may not be the Legos that you're playing with, let's say, from the business perspective. So, sometimes you can have a really good idea, but you don't know all the pieces they're playing with. And so this idea of collaboration, oftentimes the gating factor is how close and intimate can you be in your approach to working with your team, because you can't know all of the solutions. But if they don't know that, hey, for instance, you have a device and you decide that it's going to go direct to consumer. And now the device, the engineers say, well, what kind of shelf conditions do we need? And you say, well, it might go through like an Amazon warehouse. So it could be any temperature. And you say, well, all right, well, this is the device, we can make that. And then you say, well, maybe it's going to be in a hospital and we're going to control the shipping. And it's like, well, there's many, many possibilities now. In the same way that this could be in clinical end use. And so oftentimes there are many cycles. And so having conversations like even, sort of casual conversations like we're having now, where we continue to have that curiosity of, what if we did this? Okay, if I change this, will this help, right? What does this change for you? And recognizing that the clinicians are looking at endpoints. And so they're often trying to find a solution where they just want the device to work, for instance. And so that also goes towards your patients, right? At the end of the day, we often make a device more and more complex because we've built this up. And it's easy to forget that the patient doesn't know what your device looks like. They don't know what it does, and they just have a problem and they want you to solve it. And so sometimes we've built up that we've worked so hard and so long that we must have this intricate device. And sometimes a clinician might say something like, well, if you just did it this way, oh, we'd need like only this. And you say, oh, that's not how we built our business plan. And the engineers have this design, and we get sucked into it. And especially in a regulated industry where you're talking about, we've already done a clinical, we've spent this money. And so I think it really puts such there's the upfront work. And then there's also just how closely are you really collaborating and listening to your collaborators and constantly sort of evaluating and questioning what's going on without, of course, we all have to make progress, right? And we have to continue to drive a timeline and things like that. But we have to be open and curious about those things as we work through it.
Yeah, I love that listening aspect, right? And as you're describing it, and thank you for that answer. I'm thinking about it. It really takes the word I'm thinking about is a lot of elegance and design, right? Because you're doing a lot of complex things behind the scenes, where maybe myself as a patient that doesn't understand the diagnosis or really what's going on, just for me to maybe hit a button, right, to activate stuff. So to me, that sounds like it's pretty elegant.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a usability element that maybe we haven't touched on yet, which is that maybe 10 years ago or even still today, there are applications where your device can be fully, focused on clinical use, right? Clinical outcome. And there are other wearables where today they are merging with the sort of design aspect of consumer electronics, where if your device isn't also ultra thin and has a decent look to it, that really determines the success of some of these devices. And so now you're bringing in that you have to have, not only does your device have to work and it has to have clinical efficacy, but you have to have usability and manufacturability. And so, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point, but there's this sort of collaboration where now you have more collaborators, right? And now you have more voices with table stakes that say, it's great that you want this device that works, but you do have to make it comfortable to wear and it has to look decent. And so, if you're sticking a large insulin pump to your abdomen, that's not very comfortable to sleep on. It doesn't, if you're a runner, it's not going to stay on very long. And so now you have multiple studies being juggled in your timelines, and those things have to be considered now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
usability, Tom, when Kevin brought that, so huge these days. We had a device we were working with a company on a little while ago, and it was actually for patients with dementia. And you think of the usability factor in that, something that they didn't even think about. It was for tracking for falls, things like that. But an elderly patient with dementia is wondering, why do I even have this sensor on my body? So it's a usability factor that if you're not listening, you're not talking to them, their failures in their clinicals and things were basically, these patients, what do I have this on? I don't want this on. What's it doing? Those things have to be taken into account and you have to really listen to who your patients are, who's administering it, and then translate that into device language, because we've had some unique challenges in that area. That was just one thing that popped into my mind when Kevin was talking about that. Literally, the patients were taking them off because they didn't know what and why they had them on there. Fantastic device, but the usability of it didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. And, to build on that, John, right, we've talked about extending the product life and some of these challenges. Maybe we can take another layer here and get into how does your team kind of come together to solve some of these challenges? Kevin mentioned a lot of collaboration, a lot of table stakes, a lot of stakeholders. It was starting to get a headache just thinking about all that, frankly. So, how do you work through that? What are the best practices you might share with our gurus out there to how to manage all that?
I mean, I think the first thing you have to look at is every device is unique. I've seen thousands of medical devices come through our business over the years, and entrepreneurs, things like that, and everyone's unique. And you may think, hey, I'm just replicating this or doing something that someone else is doing, but take a look at the sensors on the market right now for glucose monitoring, how different they all are in size and shape, and where they may be placed on the body, whether it's abdomen or arms. Everyone's different. And so you can't go in with a preconceived notion of I'm just replicating something. And when you're asking a partner who you're collaborating with, you can start with replicating, but you really have to understand your individual situation, where it is on the body, where the stress is with the device. A lot of people would say, hey, a small device should be easier to stick to the body than a big device. Well, a small device has less adhesion area to bond to the body and hold in place, whereas the big device may spread out its stresses over a much larger area, creating, actually maybe an easier way to adhere it to the body. So you can start off with some replication, but you have to realize your device is unique and you have to have that understanding. Otherwise, it won't work. I mean, the other challenge that we do get with wear time and wearables and devices and developing them is really, we've talked a lot about this cycle and longer wear time, spreading it out. Well, as soon as you do longer wear time, if you're only going to do clinicals to prove out your device, those clinicals now, if I'm doing a wound dressing, it may be a day, 2 days, 3 days, or 4 days. If I'm doing a wearable device that's 30 days, it just by nature slows down my development process. It's going to take you 30 days to collect all that information, multiple data points, observations, and the analysis on it may be even longer. So that's the other challenge from a wear time standpoint, from a wearable standpoint, is just the clinical cycle time. So the closer you get, this ties a little bit back to what we talked about before in really understanding your clinicals and translating that to what you can do on the bench to replicate those failure modes is going to speed up your cycle time. Because we see many people that just run cycle and clinical after clinical and change something without understanding it. And it's really a challenge just because it takes 30 days to run that full clinical on there. And like Kevin was saying, if we could as we move to, if we do 90 days or even, let's say, a year long or something like that with these devices, again, you're going in the right direction of treatment. But how long is that going to take you to cycle through any clinicals and prove that out and meet the needs that you need to prove either effectiveness or even to a regulatory body? You have to figure out how to navigate that challenge. And so for any of those entrepreneurs is, you may have the greatest sensor, but you need to understand that ecosystem of the whole device and how it wears and pull that out of it. Otherwise, you'll be running clinicals till the end of time on that. So
Yeah, that's helpful. And Kevin, I'm thinking of your background as well. It's tough to maybe ask for the toughest problem, but was there a memorable problem or challenge that you had to solve in wearable design? And maybe more importantly, what did you learn from it?
Yeah, I think consistently, to sort of piggyback on what John's saying, is that because the bottleneck is often in clinical evaluation, you often have one, maybe two clinicals if as a luxury to evaluate your designs and move forward. And so probably the toughest challenge to date that we work with is how do we look at a clinical and think about what the endpoints are and develop lab tests to accurately represent that, right? Because you pretty much have one or two shots to design these. You don't usually get to run a clinical with 10 or 15 designs at the end, and you can't really afford to necessarily, right? You have to really know. And so for us, we've spent the better part of the last 15 years developing models, both computational models and models in the lab to replicate skin wear. And so evaluating those, when someone says, well, can you make a skin replica in the lab that lives and breathes and does all those things? And then when we look at that, how does that help us to inform design for devices as we work with customers where, sometimes they'll run a clinical, or we will, and we'll see, okay, going back to like, what data do you really get out of a clinical? If you have, let's say your device wears for 15 days, and it's like, well, there was 20% of people, we don't know anything about them. Why did it fall off? Why did it fail? And connecting that, you could, as soon as you find that out, it's usually from that start to finish to go back and run another clinical is a minimum of about a year from planning to start over. And so that doesn't answer your question very quickly, especially if you don't really know why. And so for us, the toughest challenges are taking that information and developing lab tests and getting meaningful data out that drives that across all these different device designs, right? Which really is a complicating factor. So there's very unique ones, certainly, right? I mean, we have to figure out it geography based, or is it genetics? Is it inherent to the device design? So they're really wide ranging.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, none of this is inexpensive either, right?
No,
Yeah.
of course not.
Yeah. Exactly. So, thinking now about the future, right? This seems like a really exciting time at Solventum. So, John, maybe you can help us here. What do you see in the future? What are you and your team thinking? Where's your group going to be at Solventum in the next 5 or 10 years? What does future hold?
Yeah, no, good question. And I'll just say, I'll start with maybe on this one. Many people don't know that Solventum is the spinoff from 3M. It was basically the spinoff of $8 billion healthcare business from 3M. And so when you're asking, about where we're going in the future, that spinoff was key for us to really focus on healthcare and really focus on solutions for healthcare going forward. And we've got sort of a phrase internally, solving what matters. And everyone that went with this healthcare spinoff really has that as part of their heart. I mean, solving is part of our name, Solventum, and that was done on purpose to look at what matters. And so when you look at our group, where we're going the next 5 to 10 years, it really is looking at those healthcare trends and materials that support them. We mentioned chronic disease management, and we've mentioned diabetes a couple of times because that's what everybody hears about day in and day out is diabetes. It's out front there, but there's a lot of other chronic diseases that people don't even recognize. I actually like the one that's really sleep management now is recognized as a chronic disease. And when I was growing up and young, okay, you snored. That's what it was. The health effects they're finding from people snoring and not breathing while they're sleeping, recovery and chronic issues that come from that, it was never recognized 20 years ago that, hey, this is something to be managed and looked at. And so when we look at going forward, it's really from our medical technologies group, it's really, what materials and things may aid in those chronic disease management areas. We can't touch them all as Solventum, and that's where we're here as an OEM group to help provide the technologies to solve that. So that's one. And then the other one we talked about realistically is the changing global population. We're aging. The number of people over 70 as a percentage is going to double and triple in the next couple of decades. Just we're living longer and the people aren't having as many children around the world. And so, we're getting older and that causes changes to your body that we're looking at from a material standpoint. How does that affect it? As you get older, your thin gets thinner, much more fragile, tears easily, breaks easily. So we're focusing on solutions that really meet the needs of the skin, are really gentle, but you still have to have aggressive adhesion, for example. So balancing those properties, we talked about diabetes. You've got these big glucose pumps to supply glucose in a loop to you. Well, as you get older, you're still going to need that, but you're going to need something different to hold on to your skin, hold it on gently, doesn't hurt you because you have to wear that every day. So really, we're looking at those chronic diseases and extending the wear time that we talked about, solutions in that area, but also protecting the skin, things like advanced silicone adhesives for bearing more weight, but being very gentle on the skin because, again, we're changing and we have to continue to change with materials in that direction.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. And Kevin, I'm interested in your perspective without giving away any trade secrets here. Of course, what do you see? What does the future hold, and what is your team focusing on?
So I guess this is a easy question, but hard to answer. Without I could talk about this for hours. So I'll try and keep it simple to just one, right? Which is, this sort of study of the microbiome, right? I think this is something that's been, I think it's fair to say, a hot topic of late, but I think we're only just getting knee deep into studying the microbiome, and sort of even less so when we think about the skin. We're talking mostly about the gut microbiome, but we don't really talk as much about the skin microbiome, let alone how it affects diagnostics, right? And so I think at a high level, right, we will see this trend where the diagnostics that are focused today are focused on sort of classic analytes that we test in clinics today. And I guess the most exciting shift, right, is that we are not just learning about these new things that we want to study and how they're affecting, but also I think we're getting, in the short term, we're getting more comfortable with that, the going to wearables, right? The shift from going from finger pricks of you test this once, maybe a month, once a year, right? A very 0 to 1, right? Oh, you did a blood test, you have high cholesterol. Here's a cholesterol drug. Well, it's not as simple when you go, well, we've actually monitored your cholesterol over a year, and now sometimes it's high, but sometimes it's low. And so we're getting more expertise in the diagnostics and wearables area. That's really exciting to really think about, like, what is the threshold that are meaningful. And so, well, of course, I'm very excited about where the future holds in the next 10 to 20 years with thinking about the microbiome. I think in the short term, what we're going to see is thinking about how do we really process the information we're taking in that is and making it clinically meaningful, right? I think what we hear from clinicians often today is it's really great that you have this data. It either doesn't work in our system, or I don't know when it's good and bad yet. And so I think for the folks that are very excited about AI and how it works on the software side, right? And we're certainly more focused, towards the material side. But I think short term, there's a lot of gain from the sort of upswell that we had in activity post-COVID, where everybody wanted to make a wearable. And now we've gotten to that point where I think everybody's made one before or is starting to say, okay, well, I've done this a little bit. Now I have to do it better. And now I have to have clinical endpoints that clinicians go, yep, I know how to react to this, right? And so I think that's a lot of the activity that's happening. Well, for us, it's a lot about how do we improve skin health? How do we wear and live with these devices? And then, long term, we'll see what they can tell us.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, John and Kevin, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge and thank you both for being our gurus. It's really been terrific having you today. If somebody wants to learn more about Solventum and some of the projects or maybe partner with you, how do they do that? Kevin, maybe we start with you. Are you on LinkedIn? Is there a way of contacting you? How do we learn more?
So I am on LinkedIn. We also have, and John can add to this, on our website, there is a My Materials Finder. There's a way to make requests. And then, of course, we have an excellent sales force that also interacts. And we work, one of the great things about our team is we work very close between our scientists and our sales force in terms of, and our customers. Oftentimes, we're right there in all of our meetings. It's much less a case of you meet with one person, I'll send an email, maybe you hear back, right? Oftentimes we work in close collaboration to speak to, how close you have to work to find solutions here.
And John, how about with you? How do we find out more?
Yeah. So, before I get into that, I'll echo what Kevin said. He works very closely with many of our customers, meaning an R&D person in the background, is interfacing with customers. And I think that lends itself really well to what we talked about before, really understanding that full ecosystem to make sure your device works. But from my perspective, LinkedIn, easiest way to get a hold of me, get in touch with me. I pay attention to it and interact with it quite a bit. So that's the number one thing. The other thing, like Kevin said, solventum.com is one place, but findmymaterial.com is something that we have set up as an interface, basically, that asks you some of the device questions that you may have and leads you to some solutions and samples to give you a good understanding when you're just coming in out of the blue looking at some different solutions. So I would recommend that, as well as, again, you can always reach out to me through LinkedIn, and glad to hear from you.
Oh, that's fantastic. So Kevin and John, once again, thank you so much for the input and expertise you brought to us today.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to MedTech Gurus. I am Sylvester Harris, your MC. If you want to learn more about Tom and his consulting services, you can go to www.pctmedical.com or email Tom at tom@pctmedical.com. Now, I can be reached at Sylvester Harris, that's SylvesterHarris 5048@gmail.com, and I'd be pleased to discuss any voiceover work that you may want for your company or broadcast. Hey, thanks so much for listening, and catch us on the next episode of MedTech Gurus.